There's a reason Theodore Roosevelt earned elite placement on Mount Rushmore alongside Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson. Perhaps no other American represents the spirit of individualism and the force of will like the man known by his initials, TR. In manhood, he shed almost every reminder of his early life as a sickly asthmatic who took up boxing and other physical exertions to overcome the limits of youth. As an adult, Roosevelt's way of life was defined by this phrase, the strenuous life, inspiring boys to enlist and men to explore the unconquered lands of the West. But from where did this great man derive strength? And from where did the courage and clarity of his convictions derive themselves? Was he a stoic or a man of faith? Did he use the words of religion to sell a cause, or did he believe them in his heart? Tonight we'll talk to a man who believes he has answers. Stay with us. The 26th President of the United States wrote this about the need for biblical literacy. The teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and entwined with our whole civic and social life that it would be literally impossible for us to figure to ourselves what that life would be if these teachings were removed. But was this a statement from a man convinced in his heart? Or like other presidents before and since, did he view Christian teaching as a useful tool to keep order and unify in times of crisis? Was he a cultural Christian, a public supporter of Christianity, or a follower of Jesus? We'll never know what was in his heart, on this side of eternity at least. But my guest, Ben Wetzel, has been digging deep into the life of President Theodore Roosevelt for the answer. Dr. Wetzel, welcome to State of Independence. It's great to have you on. I want to ask you why Theodore Roosevelt, but tell me first about you. You've got some linkage to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I think through Grove City College. Tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you, Joe. I am a native Pennsylvanian, and I went to Grove City College for my undergraduate degree, which was a great experience. I went on to do a master's at Baylor University and then a PhD at Notre Dame. And now I am assistant professor of history at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana.
That's great. That's great. Well, I know Taylor University from my time in Indiana. It's a great school, and delighted that you're there. So what was it about you about Theodore Roosevelt that drew you to him? That's a big question. He clearly is such an extraordinary person to study. In my study of American presidents, he clearly is a one of a kind. And his story is amazing. I mean, having come from privilege as he did, but yet and still overcoming his physical limitations as a kind of a sickly boy to become a real strapping man and somebody who was full of the outdoors and full of the desire to take on every physical challenge. What drew you to Theodore Roosevelt?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, almost no president has had the kind of varied and adventurous career that Theodore Roosevelt had. He was a rancher in the Badlands in the Dakota Territory. He was a New York City police commissioner. He was a soldier in the Spanish-American War. He was a big game hunter in Africa, an explorer in South America, and of course, president for 7 years. So I've always been drawn to the personality, the character, the accomplishments of Theodore Roosevelt. But how I came to this study in particular is Oxford University Press is doing a series called Spiritual Lives, where there are various people who are being profiled in that series who are famous for something other than religion, but for whom religion or doubt was significant for them. So there are some books on Benjamin Franklin, on Queen Victoria, on Margaret Mead, Woodrow Wilson. And so I approached the editor of the series and asked if he would be interested in a volume on Theodore Roosevelt for this series, and he was. And so I set to learn out all that I could about TR, his faith, what had been written about it to that point, if there was anything to write about. And then eventually the book came from that.
What do historians say about TR's faith? I mean, many people may not be aware of some of the sadness in his life. I'm guessing that probably shaped him as much as anything else. I know that he lost his mother, to whom he was close, and his wife, his first wife, on the same day. I just can't imagine that kind of a tragedy, that kind of a sadness. But he lost them both on the same day. Do you think that had an impact on him spiritually, or did it in some way draw him closer to God?
Well, I think it definitely had an impact on him. So you're right. His mother, Martha, who they called Mitty, and his first wife, Alice, died on the same day, February 1884, in the same house in New York City. And TR was an assemblyman in Albany, New York at that time. He got a telegram telling him he needed to come home. His wife had just given birth to their daughter, who they also named Alice, and he got on a train. It took him 5 hours to get from Albany to New York City because it was very foggy that evening. And when he got there, he basically had time to say goodbye to both of them as they passed away. I think it had an extraordinary impact on him. In terms of faith, maybe not for the better. To this point, he had grown up in a very devout household, and he showed probably most of his evangelical or strong sides of faith as a young man, as a Sunday school teacher, as a Harvard student. When his father died a few years before in 1878, his diaries are full of religious writings and recordings of him praying and things like that. In 1884, when Alice and Mitty died, he took up his diary, he drew a big black X, and he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." And there's really no written evidence of him processing that in the religious terms that he did for his father. So he's only 25 years old when this tragedy happens to him, and he by no means gives up on faith or on church. But I do think it was a turning point for him where his faith became a little less personal, a little more detached.
Now, he also had kind of a tortured relationship with his oldest daughter, Alice, as I understand it, and that lasted for the balance of his life, that he was not as close to her as he was to the second group of kids that he had with his second wife. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. Alice always felt that she was different from the other 5 children that he would go on to have with his wife, his second wife, Edith. Part of that was because TR refused to talk about Alice's mother to her, or really to anybody. There is almost no evidence of him ever talking about the first Alice ever again after her passing in 1884. And psychologically, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, his daughter, would go on to relate many years later, and she lived till about 1980, that this was just hard for her not to hear much about who her mother was. And she was very much like her father in some ways. They both loved the spotlight. And TR once said when he was president that he could either be president or he could govern Alice, but he could not do both at the same time. And so there's always some hurt, always some tension in that relationship.
Yeah, that's kind of sad. I'm wondering if it was maybe too painful a thing for him to ever talk about his wife who passed away to him so unexpectedly, and or whether he placed some hidden blame on young Alice because her birth was what caused his wife's death. I suppose we'll never know, but he had other tragedy as well in his family. He had a younger brother who was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, who married Franklin Roosevelt, and his younger brother had a very, very difficult time, as I understand, and eventually died from alcoholism, among other things. I don't know if he took his own life or if he just died at a young age due to heavy drinking. But I do know that his younger brother had a particularly difficult time, and I've never read anything that says the impact of that on Theodore Roosevelt, other than he was very kindly to his niece, Eleanor, and was a surrogate father to her. But I've never read anything that talked about the impact that his younger brother's demise may have had on him.
Yeah, all that is correct. His younger brother, Elliot, had some health problems throughout his life. He turned to drink as one way of coping with that, but his life quickly unraveled at a pretty young age. He was married. He had 3 children, including Eleanor, who would, of course, go on to be famous in her own right. TR and the rest of the family decided that he was not mentally competent. For a time, they had him committed to an insane asylum in France. He kind of got out of that. He started to try to put his life back together, but then his wife, Anna, passed away from diphtheria. They lost a child. He went back to drinking. and he had seizures, and he died at 34.
34.
And so TR was very alienated from him at that point. He took a very, understandably, but took a very moralistic attitude toward Eliot's behavior, his drinking, and then also the several mistresses that Eliot had taken. He didn't want anything to do with him. He thought he was just not capable of being reformed any longer. But when Eliot passed away, their sister Corinne related that when Theodore saw the body, that he was overcome and he cried like a child for a long time.
Yeah.
So he did love his brother, and you're right that he did take a special interest in Eleanor. He was the one who gave her away in 1905 when she married Franklin Roosevelt, and he continued to have a relationship with her and FDR until his own death in 1919.
Yeah. So what do historians say about this man who was larger than life? I mean, I was reading the account of the wedding for, I think, Eleanor Roosevelt, where he gave her away. And it was written by somebody or said by somebody that Theodore Roosevelt wanted to be the widow, the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and something else. But basically, what it was saying is that he wanted to be the life of the party, the center of attention wherever he was. And he clearly was always the center of attention. Tell me what historians say about the faith of this man. Was it a political tool for him? Because he was extraordinarily successful as president. I mean, so popular and so compelling in his capacity to stir Americans. Or was his faith something that was deep-seated and personal and real to him? What do other historians say?
Yeah, it's a great question. The quote you were bringing up is from Alice Roosevelt Longworth, so one more example of that kind of sarcastic relationship or that contentious relationship that they had. Historians have been all over the map with TR's faith. And that goes back to the time of his death and the aftermath. The first systematic study of it was done in the early 1920s by a Methodist minister named Christian Reisner, and he really wanted to try to prove that his hero TR was a Christian. And he, through 400 pages, compiled a lot of quotations and testimony from friends and family that TR was definitely a Christian. In the 1930s, the pendulum swung the other way, and the writer Gamaliel Bradford declared that he had read books like Reisner's, and he found no evidence that TR had any faith, and added, rather caustically, that TR was so larger than life that he had no room for God in his own sort of sense of self-importance. And historians really haven't gotten any clarity on that since. There have been some who have said that he has had a subdued and orthodox faith. Some have questioned whether he was an agnostic. Others have said he was a muscular Christian in keeping with the late 19th century model. Others have said he's a mainline Christian. So what my book tries to do is to try to add some clarity to that, what we can say and what we can't say. You mentioned that what we can't say was really what was in his heart. What's not written down, what's not available to us. Was he truly a believer? Will we see him in heaven? Those are a little bit beyond the scope of what I feel like I can say as an historian. Right. What I try to point out in the book and the argument that I put forth is that there are four themes that run through TR's life when it comes to religion. And number one, quickly, he was a religious pilgrim who went from a pretty serious faith as a young man, a pretty personal faith, to a more detached, although sincere faith as an adult. Number two, he was a bully pulpit preacher who used the language of the King James Bible throughout his life to exhort his fellow citizens to good works. Three, he was a religious ecumenist, or one who believed that a variety of religions, and certainly Christian denominations, were all good as long as they promoted morality and right living. And it didn't really matter too much what you thought about God or Jesus Christ or predestination or the afterlife or baptism or things like that, as long as you were doing good works. And then lastly, he was a defender of the separation of church and state and opposed any government funding for sectarian purposes. So those are the things that I feel like we can see through his faith in his life. He went to church his whole life. He quoted the Bible all the time. He definitely believed in God. He talked less about Jesus Christ, less about particular doctrines. I think went away from more the personal side of things, but certainly was engaged with Christian organizations and Christian causes throughout his life.
What about that big family that he had with his second wife, Edith, those kids? I mean, I've read stories about his wife saying that he was the oldest of the kids, that he was a ringleader in much of the merriment that went on at Sagamore Hill where they lived. leading the charge for a lot of the games and the things that were going on there. Tell me, is there any evidence that God was at the center of life at Sagamore Hill, or that there was some kind of at least routine exercise of faith there?
There is some evidence for that. I would say, to the extent that God was central at Sagamore Hill, Edith was responsible for seeing that he got the central place. His second wife, Edith, was pretty devout Episcopalian and pretty devoted to the Episcopal Church. She led the children through more typical Protestant devotions. All of their boys went to the Groton School in Massachusetts, a private
My two brothers went to the Groton School, so.
Oh, you know Groton.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
well, this is great. In their day, this would have been seriously Protestant to some extent, and the rector, Endicott Peabody, was a social gospel kind of Christian. So they would have gotten faith there. Their kids were confirmed in the church. I think their daughter Ethel taught a Sunday school class, as TR himself had done. So he supported it. I don't think he enthused about it, maybe to the extent that Edith did, but he was quietly supportive of their religious devotions. And the kids themselves went in a variety of directions with that as adults themselves.
Any word from any of the people that pastored him about him? Were there any pastors that wrote and said, said one thing or the other about Teddy Roosevelt?
There is some evidence from that. So he himself was confirmed in the Dutch Reformed Church in the 1870s in New York City, and his pastor was still living when TR died in 1919. And he gave an account of the conversation they had had when TR requested permission to join the church and said he wanted to take the step. He wanted to become an official member. Now, I have some suspicions about how accurate, word for word, that conversation would have been in this man's memory, 40 years later. But he did give an account that TR came to faith in that church, that he was a serious, militant kind of Christian. And the church itself, the Collegiate Reformed Church of St. Nicholas, when he died, was very proud that he had become a member of that church when he was a child.
Yeah, they were a very well-off family, the Roosevelt family, as I understand it. So he would have been born into great privilege. Is that right?
That's definitely right. The Roosevelts had been in Manhattan since the 17th century, since it was Dutch New York. The family had made money through glass importing, through real estate, through other means. And Theodore Roosevelt's father really didn't have to work to earn an income, and neither did TR. So TR Sr., a devout Christian himself, devoted a lot of time to philanthropic work. And when he died, TR wrote in his diary that he was left $8,000 a year, which would be something like $200,000 a year in today's terms. So we miss part of the picture if we don't understand the wealth and privilege that family enjoyed.
Yeah, that's quite something. It didn't seem to separate him from people. You'd think that because he was a beneficiary of such great wealth that it would have been really hard for him to relate to the common man or the common woman in his day. But that seems to be quite the opposite. That he was very compelling to regular people in his day. And is that true? That
he changed on that. As a young man, when he went to Harvard, he wrote home and saying that he was choosing his friends based on their social background. He did not want to be close friends with someone who didn't have the kind of pedigree and background that he did. But he shed that. And part of the reason he shed that was after Alice and Mitty died, when he went to his ranches in the Dakota Territory. And again, think about the $80,000 that he spent to buy this property in the Dakota Territory and to set up these ranches. When he went to live in the West, he encountered different kinds of people who he had never met at Harvard, who he had never met in New York City. And he changed, and they changed him to an extent. And thereafter, he related very well to the ordinary people. He still had a sense, I think, throughout his life, to some extent, that he was a little bit set apart. He was a little bit different. But he did much, much better with relating to ordinary people, with their concerns. And he was quite effective of that as a politician.
We're going to give Dr. Wetzel a chance to catch his breath. This has been extraordinary, but we'll be right back with Dr. Ben Wetzel, so stay with us.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
We're talking about one of the grand figures of the American story, Theodore Roosevelt and his relationship with God. If you'd like to dig deeper, get Dr. Ben Wetzel's book, The Bully Pulpit President. I think you'll be inspired. Dr. Ben, Theodore Roosevelt is one of I guess, 4 Americans that have their faces chiseled into Mount Rushmore. He's there with George Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln. Illustrious company, to say the least. Tell me what your sense is of him in that group of those 4 great American presidents.
Well, Roosevelt is always at the top of the list when historians are asked to give rankings of presidents. And some of that has to do with his presidency itself, and part of it has to do with his accomplishments outside of politics. In his presidency, he was the first to do a number of things. The first to leave the country while in office, when he went to supervise the building of the Panama Canal, which the land for that being acquired under his presidency. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize. And no American, I don't think, had ever won the Nobel Peace Prize at that point. And he got that for his role in mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, a conflict that he was concerned about because of the balance of power in the Far East. He was the first president to go up in an airplane, and he had peace in his time as president, and he worried that he would never be a first-rank president because he hadn't had to deal with war or with a major crisis while president. But he expanded the power of the presidency in a number of ways. He had a number of international achievements. And then he walked away from it in 1908.
Yeah.
And in 1908,
which he was sorry, I think, right? He had second thoughts once he did that?
He did. He told a friend that he would cut off his hand if he could recall his statement about not running again in 1908. But he came into the presidency because William McKinley had been assassinated, and he had had 3+ years in his first term. He had been elected in his own right in 1904. He could have run again in 1908. There was no constitutional provision to prohibit it at that point. But he wanted to honor the precedent set by George Washington. And he announced when he had won in 1904 that he would not be a candidate again in 1908. And he did come to regret that. He did ultimately run again.
Yeah, that's right. He wasn't pleased with Taft, and he ran again. Right. And we know what happened with that. How that the outcome of that was nothing too good certainly for Republicans.
Right.
But that being said, in his later years, he takes a trip, I think, with his son. Was it Kermit? He may have gone with Kermit on this extraordinary expedition, and he nearly dies in that. But do you think that had anything to do with changing him in his last days?
It did. So what you're talking about, in 1914, he and his son Kermit, along with a party of Americans and some Brazilians, sent out to explore an unknown river in Brazil. Again, these are one of the things that he did outside of the presidency. It was a harrowing journey. It was an arduous experience. He contracted malaria. He cut his leg, developed an infection. He had surgery on the jungle floor without any anesthetic on that leg. He lost 55 pounds in the experience, but he and his party succeeded in putting the River of Doubt on the map, whereas no North Americans or Europeans really knew where that river went beforehand. It changed him in that he's never fully healthy again after that time. He was in pain a lot of the time, I think, throughout the rest of his life. But this is his last kind of scientific expedition, and he told a friend it was his last chance to be a boy.
Wow. Well, Dr. Wetzel, I need to tell you that I really appreciate you writing this book. I hope you'll bring the hidden and often private world of faith of America's leaders out into the light with this, and we can certainly use those examples today. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
I'll be right back with our great producer, Jeff Coleman, with closing thoughts.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
So now let's talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well, the only reason that we booked this program is because my son is named for Theodore Roosevelt, our older son, Teddy.
Yeah.
Look, I love this conversation because my questions about not just famous people, but people who I admire in history are always, they always go to what were they really like and what really motivated these individuals to do what they did. You know, Winston Churchill or Queen Elizabeth or Teddy Roosevelt. There are very few people that kind of fit this leadership model of being publicly impactful, but also having this private faith that you can connect the two.
Yeah.
Often you see people using faith as a utility. My answer, I think, from our guest today was that it was probably likely that at least in the beginning stages of life, the foundations of faith were there, and perhaps that became the battery that sustained him the rest of his life, but perhaps not being always aware of God's presence or him being directed in those moments. But you can't look at TR's life and say that when you take a bullet and you end up giving the speech with the bullet lodged in your chest, that you are sustained by ego alone. There's got to be something else there, but he certainly still remains a bit of a mystery.
Yeah. Well, the only glimpses we have of who he might have been are in the episodes that we know about in his life that kind of tell what his character was. So like inviting Booker T. Washington to his home to have dinner with himself and his family at a time when that was unheard of says something about the man's character.
Where does his courage come from, right? Yeah. Where does the courage, when you know the press will be bad, when you know that racists are going to respond a certain way, what gives you the courage in that moment to do what's right or take the long view of history? That's so much of his greatness there.
Yeah. What a great and extraordinary person. I wish I could have met him.
I hope I get to meet him one day. I really do.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Well, Theodore Roosevelt is a favorite president of Jeff's and mine and a worthy role model for aspiring leaders. But for all his good work, he doesn't come close to the standard of the one who lived the perfect life we will never live, in spite of all our strain and effort. That's Jesus, the Christ. I want to thank Dr. Wetzel for sharing his view of the 26th president with us today. And friend, if you're new to our program or a regular member of our TV family, drop me a line at joewatkins.org to let me know if this topic and our guest, Dr. Ben Wetzel, was encouraging to you. I hope that he was. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins with Jeff Coleman. Thanks so much for watching. So is your son's middle name Roosevelt?
No, George. It's Theodore George, so he picked up his grandfather's first name. Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.